we've got the original paradisal state and then the collapse. And so now, metaphysically speaking, we're in the collapse. We're in the post-fall condition. We're still occupying a mythological landscape. Right? This isn't history as we normally understand it. It's meta-history. So when we talk about Cain and Abel, we're actually talking about the first two real human beings. Because Adam and Eve, A, were created by God, and B, were in paradise. And so that's not the normative condition of human beings, right? That's a special time that's outside of normal time and space. So, and Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Okay, so Abel's a shepherd, and Cain is a farmer. The shepherd is an archetypal symbol, because the shepherd is the leader of a flock. And the shepherd is the heroic leader of a flock, and the reason, this is Middle Eastern mythology, let's say, well, if you were a shepherd, what did you do? You took your slingshot and your stick and you defended your nice, juicy, plump, delicious sheep against lions. So Abel was a keeper of sheep and Cain was a tiller of the ground, which isn't as heroic a role. And so right off the bat, you get this dichotomy between the two roles. It's also of great interest that Cain is the older brother and Abel is the younger brother. And you see that very frequently in mythology, because the older brother is the one that's privileged by status, right? So he's got privilege, Cain, because he's the elder brother. That also means that if there are possessions to be handed down the generations, the older brother gets them. Now, interestingly enough, Cain has privilege, but he's not the one that's favored by God. And I think it's absolutely brilliant that it's set up that way, because it's actually Abel who doesn't have the right that the firstborn has, who actually turns into the person who's the proper manifestation of the ideal. It's because Cain has things given to him. You might think, well, that's great, he's privileged, what a wonderful thing for Cain. It's like, don't be so sure about that. And in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and his offering, but unto Cain and his offering he had no respect. And Cain was very wroth, angry, and his countenance fell. Okay, so again, there's a tremendous amount packed into that. This is the first time that we see the motif of sacrifice. Imagine that you're a farmer back when that was an extraordinarily, you were barely scraping out a living doing that. It was hand to mouth at best. All right, so now it's winter and you've got your damn seeds in your cellar, right? What are you going to do? You're starving. You going to eat them? Or are you going to wait and plant them again in the spring? Because that's your damn choice. And so the people who decided to eat them, well, some of the people who decided to save them died. Well, let's say more of the people who decided to eat them died. And so this sort of knowledge was gathered in unbelievable agony. You don't get what you want right now. For you, that's nothing, because you're very much accustomed to getting what you want all the time right now, roughly speaking, you know, compared to people who live from hand to mouth. But back when things were much rougher, the idea that you had to sacrifice something of value now to be paid off in the future, man, that was a rough thing to accept. Okay, so what happened? So people figured this out somehow. They figured out that you could make an offering of something you valued, and that might help set the world straight. How did they conceptualize that? Well, they conceptualized it ritually. They were acting it out to begin with. And the sacrificial ritual is a drama that points to a higher psychological truth. And the higher psychological truth is let go of what you value now, and perhaps that will pay off manifold in the future. You're making a bargain. And then you might say, well, who are you making a bargain with? And you could say, well, nature. But that's not exactly right. It's not exactly right, because let's say I have something of value in a social organization. And I'm going to let it go because I'm relying on a corresponding reward or a greater reward in the future. It's a contractual relationship with other people. It's not a relationship with nature. It's that we've organized ourselves into a social structure, and we're willing to maintain the integrity of the social structure across time, so that if I give up something now, I can be paid for it in the future. And the deal is, we're going to try to keep the future the same as the present, so that those contracts can be can be met in the future. That's money. That's what money is, right? Here's some money. You made a sacrifice. That's why you get the money. What does the money signify? It's a promise from the community that the labor that you invested can be stored and then brought forward for your own purposes in the future. So it's actually part of the social contract. So the thing you're sacrificing to is the spirit of society that produces the social contract. And so that's conceptualized as God the Father. Well, how else would you conceptualize it? It's the spirit of the dominance hierarchy. That's the right way to think about it. So it's what's common across all the members of the dominance hierarchy across time. Well, it's something you can negotiate with, true or not. But what the hell do you think you're doing when you make a contract? What's the law? It's all of this. It's the manifestation of that patriarchal spirit across time and space. And what do? You sacrifice to it. Well, so back 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, however old this story is, it's probably older than that. This is the best people could do with regards to realization. In process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord, and Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. Now that's interesting, eh? This is where a close reading matters. So we don't know what Cain's offering is. It's not much described. But we do know something about Abel's offering. And what we know is that by the standards of the time, it's a high quality offering. So it looks like Abel's doing a good job. That's the implication. The story doesn't say Abel is doing a really good job with his sacrifices. It just hints at it. And I like that because it leaves that ambiguity. It's like maybe you're working really hard and your brother's working really hard and you really can't tell the difference between your quality of work and his quality of work. But for some reason he's succeeding like mad. That happens, right? Because there's an arbitrary element to life. And so the story says, well, the Lord has respect unto Abel and his offering, and there's an implication that maybe the reason for that is that, you know, Cain's offerings are a little second rate, but the story doesn't come out and club you over the head with that idea. So I like that. I think it's very sophisticated. So what happens? Well, Cain makes his offerings and God isn't happy with them. Now we don't know how Cain figures out that God isn't happy with his offerings. We get some hints of that too, but the story does tell us that's what happens. And so then we get the psychological response on the part of Cain. Now one response could be, Jesus, I must be doing something wrong. I better straighten myself out. You know, I better come up with a better quality offering and try that again. That isn't what happens. What happens instead is that Cain becomes angry, wroth, and his countenance falls. And so what does that mean? It means this, right? It means he is not happy. Those two things are both put together, right? He's wroth, he's angry, and he's also depressed. And so he's in a state of mind that, well, I think the best characterization for that is hostile resentment, because it's unfair. So anyways, so God has a little chat with him and he says, well, why are you angry? If you do well, won't you be accepted? And if you don't do well, sin lies at your door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Okay, that's a very mangled translation, I would say. So I'm going to take it apart. So what God says is, well, you're angry and you're upset. It's like, well, what's your problem? And then God tells Cain, if you did things properly, they would work out for you. Well, it's the last thing he wants to hear, because what Cain wants to believe is that the reason he's not doing very well is because there's no sense having any faith in the Logos. The transcendent is evil and aimed exactly against him, and the entire social contract is faulty. That's what he wants to hear, but that isn't what God says. God says, well, wait a minute. Maybe you're doing something wrong. Well, that's maybe a worse message than everything else is corrupt. It's like, you're having a problem because you're just not everything you could be. Well, and then God says something really nasty, and you can't tell from this lines. I read a bunch of translations to try to figure out exactly what it meant. So this is what God tells Cain. Not only are you doing something wrong, you bloody well know you're doing something wrong, and you're doing it creatively and with intent. So not only are things not going well for you, but you've played a creative role in producing that situation. And so God basically says, I am taking zero responsibility for rejecting your sacrifice. It's all on you. And so Cain leaves, and believe me, he was wroth before and his countenance had fallen before, but it's nothing like it is now. And so he hits the next stage and he thinks, okay, I'm going to take my revenge. what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to find the most innocent and worthwhile thing that's favored of God, and I'm going to kill it. And that's what he does. So, and it doesn't matter that it's his brother. And Abel, you know, we're drawing the inference, Abel's done the right things, everyone likes him, everything's flourishing for Abel, he's a good guy. He's one of those people that you meet that has everything, and then you meet them and you wish you could hate them, but you can't because they're really good people, and then you really hate them. Because not only do they have everything, but it appears that they deserve it. And there's nothing that sort of sits in your soul and rots it more than that realization. And so that's the situation with Cain. And so Cain thinks, Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. So that's so interesting, because look what happens to Cain here. So he's not doing well, he's separated from the transcendent and from society, he's bitterly resentful, and now he goes out and kills the very thing that he most wants to be. So he destroys his own ideal, right? He demolishes his own ideal. That's how far his resentment has pushed him. And so he's done, right? But it doesn't matter, because it enables him to take revenge. And the Lord says unto Cain, where is Abel thy brother? And Cain said, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, that's a good question. That's why it's posed in the story, because the answer to that is supposed to be yes. And God says, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries unto me from the ground. And now you're cursed from the earth, which has opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. When you till the ground, it will not henceforth yield unto you its strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shall thou be in the earth. You know, and you might say, well, why does God not just strike Cain dead? And the answer to that perhaps is, that wouldn't be sufficient punishment. And that's what it looks like to me. It's like, what's the punishment? You live with what you did. Right? And I don't want anybody taking you out either, because then you won't have to live with what you did. So that's the punishment. And Cain says unto the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. It's like, yeah. Behold, you have driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. That's the same as what happens to Adam in the Garden of Eden. Remember, Adam hides from God, and he has his reasons. And now Cain is alienated from God. There's no reconstructing that relationship. So he's in hell for all intents and purposes. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that everyone who finds me will kill me. And God says, therefore whoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark unto Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. Now that's interesting. You think, why in the world would God protect Cain? Well, the next part of the story actually tells you that. You have a family, I have a family. Your brother kills my son. So what do? I come and I kill your father and your cousin. And then you think, well, I killed your father and your cousin. I'm going to come back and I'm going to kill 4 of your people. And then I come back and say, yeah, no problem. It's 16 of you this time. And then you come back and you say, 16, eh? Let's try for 32. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch, etc. So now you have a genealogy, right? So Cain starts to have a family, you have a genealogy. And so a number of people are named in the lineage. And it tells you what, this is sort of an attempt to describe how things came about. So this is like the naming of the heroes of old. And so you have Enoch, who builds a city. You have Jabal, who is the father of those who dwell in tents and of those who have cattle. You have Jubal, who is the father of musicians, and Zillah, who bore Tubal-Cain. Now, Tubal-Cain is a very interesting person. By tradition, Tubal-Cain is the first artificer of weapons of war. So Cain's descendant, after multiple generations, is the person who produces weapons of war. All right, and so there's another bit of the story within which that needs to be placed in context. And Lamech, who's one of the grandchildren of Cain, says unto his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech, for I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. Okay, so what he's saying is, he's been involved in a murder. If Cain be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. And so there's the implication there that the tit-for-tat process has begun. Cain kills Abel. Cain's children kill 7. Cain's grandchildren kill 70-fold. And then Tubal-Cain pops up on the horizon, and he's the person who makes artifices of war. And so the story, in its fragmentary manner, ties the individual psychopathology that's resentful and revenge-seeking to the proclivity for broad-scale warfare.